You know, most wars have a clear beginning and a clear end. But what if a war devastated an entire nation, pulled in all the world's superpowers, and killed millions, but then just never officially stopped? Well, for over 70 years, that's been the reality on the Korean Peninsula. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the forgotten war that's still shaping our world right now.
And that's really the question at the heart of all this, isn't it? It's a story about big ideas, clashing ambitions, and the unbelievable tragedy that happens when a country gets caught in the middle of a global power struggle.
Seriously, that's all it took. A simple line, sketched out by people thousands of miles away, that would set the stage for one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century.
Right, so this is the moment that the Cold War, this big, tense standoff of ideologies, suddenly became red hot. This is when the shooting started.
And this wasn't some small skirmish. Oh no, this was a full-on invasion. Backed by Soviet tanks and heavy weapons, the North Korean army just poured into South Korea. Their goal? A quick, total victory. They planned to reunite the entire Korean Peninsula by force, all under communist rule.
So, how on earth did it get to this point? I mean, why was there even a North and a South Korea to begin with? To really get that, we have to rewind the clock a little, to right after World War II ended. You have to remember, for literally centuries, Korea was one unified nation. It had this incredibly rich, independent history. But then, in 1910, Japan annexed it. And after 35 years of a really brutal colonial occupation, World War II ends, Japan surrenders, and suddenly there's this massive power vacuum on the peninsula.
And what was supposed to be a temporary fix, well, it quickly became the whole problem. The winners of the war, the US and the Soviet Union, agreed to split the job of disarming the Japanese troops. So the Soviets took the North, the Americans took the South. But for both of these new superpowers, Korea was a critical piece on this new Cold War chessboard. For the US, holding the South meant creating a buffer against communism spreading in Asia. And for the Soviets, controlling the North was all about protecting their border and expanding their own influence. So this temporary dividing line, the 38th parallel, it became permanent, and it became ideological really fast.
And just like that, you have two brand new, deeply hostile countries. In the South, the U.S. propped up the fiercely anti-communist Syngman Rhee, and up north, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung. Now here's the crucial part. Neither of these leaders saw the division as permanent. Nope. Both of them were absolutely dead set on ruling the entire peninsula. And that created this incredibly tense situation, basically a powder keg just waiting for a match.
And when that match was finally lit, it didn't just start a civil war. It exploded into something much bigger. It pulled in the entire world and turned Korea into the very first major, bloody battlefield of the Cold War.
The first year of this war was just a whiplash of brutal back-and-forth fighting. First, the North Koreans almost won the whole thing, pinning the defenders into this tiny little corner of the country. Then, boom, a brilliant, daring UN landing completely flips the script, and they drive the North Koreans all the way back almost to the Chinese border. But that move triggers China, who sends in this massive army that sends the UN forces reeling all the way back south again. It was just this incredible, violent seesaw. And after all that, the front lines basically hardened right back where everything started.
So, to try and stop these huge waves of soldiers and destroy supply lines, the U.S. just unleashed its air power. That number, that's the tons of bombs dropped on North Korea. To give you some perspective, that's more tonnage than the U.S. dropped in the entire Pacific during all of World War II. It completely leveled the country, wiping out thousands of schools and hospitals and hundreds of thousands of homes. Just staggering.
So after those wild swings in the first year, the war just ground down into this horrific, bloody stalemate. All the fighting was for inches of ground, for barren hills and muddy trenches. And the human cost, it just became almost impossible to comprehend.
These numbers, they tell a story of just sheer, unimaginable tragedy. We're talking an estimated 2.9 million North Koreans, 1.4 million South Koreans, and 600,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians killed, wounded, or missing. And the vast majority of those were just ordinary people caught in the crossfire.
And the conflict was incredibly costly for the international forces too. All those countries fighting under the UN flag. More than 44,000 of their soldiers, most of them American, died fighting to defend South Korea.
So, after 3 years of some of the most brutal fighting imaginable, this is what they agreed to. Not a peace treaty, not an end to the war, but a pause, an armistice, It stopped the shooting and created the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, which is now one of the most heavily guarded borders on the entire planet. But, and this is the key, it never formally ended the war. Technically, they are still at war today.
Okay, so what happens after you hit the pause button? Well, since 1953, North and South Korea have gone down two radically, profoundly different paths. I mean, they've created one of the starkest contrasts you can find anywhere in the world.
The legacy of that dividing line is just absolute. North Korea turned inward, becoming this isolated, totalitarian state, a real hermit kingdom. Meanwhile, South Korea, with a ton of American aid and support, completely transformed itself. It became a booming democracy and an economic giant, home to global brands like Samsung and Hyundai that we all know and use every single day.
And when you look at it all, at the final map being almost identical to the starting map, and you think about the millions of lives just erased, this sentiment just hits you. It feels so profoundly true. For the armies, it was a draw, a stalemate. But for the Korean people, it was an absolute catastrophe that tore families apart and scarred a nation forever.
And that's really the question that hangs over everything today. You've got these two nations on such wildly different paths, still technically at war with each other, and now you have to throw nuclear weapons into the mix. The unfinished business of the Korean War remains one of the world's most dangerous, most complicated challenges. Can this 70-year pause ever truly become a lasting peace? That, right there, is the ultimate question.